Thanks everybody for joining. My name's Todd Mahon. I am here to talk about interpretive exhibits in the grant program webinar here at the Minnesota Historical Society. So if that's what you're after, you're in the right spot. If that's not what you're after, not sure what I can do for you. But the topic, as I said, is about successful exhibit applications for the grant program. I introduced myself a little bit. Here's some photos of me, older. Well, you know, we're the historical society, so any photo is an old photograph, right? But here's my contact information. I believe I shared again at the end of the presentation, and if I forgot to, we can definitely come back to the slide, or I can share it out with everybody too. Certainly, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end, but if you do want to contact me about any exhibit projects or other things related to the grant program or to your local history organization, please feel free to do that. Our local history services group is a part of the grant program. We're all content reviewers for the grant program. I look at projects that are involving historical interpretation, exhibits certainly being a big part of those, but things like historical markers and other programming sorts of things are things that I will be taking a look at. I also look at collections management projects too, how to sort of organize and know what's in your collection. But we've got folks on our staff that are IT and technology, digitization folks. We've got a conservator on our staff who can talk to you about how to save and preserve the items that are in your collection for the future generations. And we've got folks that understand National Register buildings and certainly how our grant program can help with them, but how you can take care of them. So that's what we do with local history services. And then we have our wonderful and talented grants administration staff, the grants office, the GO team as we affectionately call them. And they can help you with getting ready for the grant program, getting your account set up, and all those wonderful administrative things that might be touched on here, but that I can sort of mostly tap dance around and then turn you to the right person. Things like procurement and required attachments and how you do those things in our grant portal Flux. What are we going to cover today? I'm going to talk a little bit about certainly eligibility for not only for the grant program, but exhibit projects that are eligible for the grant program. We're going to talk about how you plan exhibits, how you research and write them, and then how you do what we call implementation, the fabrication and installation of the exhibit. And there'll be time for questions and maybe even answers at the end. Hopefully there'll be answers for the questions as well. So I guess that's it. Let's roll into it. First and foremost, it's the grant program has a couple of levels of eligibility. They're pretty easy to meet, but if you are to be eligible to apply to the grant program as an applicant, you have to be one of 4 types of organizations: a nonprofit, 501c3 nonprofit organization, state and local government units in Minnesota, federally recognized tribes in Minnesota, and educational institutions. So if you are one of those, then you are likely good to go. What type of projects will we do? As far as what we're talking about here, there are projects that need to focus on preserving Minnesota history. So the exhibit has to talk about Minnesota history. So we wouldn't necessarily do an exhibit on, I don't know, a million other topics, but it's got to focus on Minnesota history. And certainly there's some latitude in that too. And I think that's one of those things where if you are sort of wondering how it might fit, I think that's something where you can come and talk to some of the grant staff and grant program folks, and we can help you figure out that piece of it. All right, this is a slide that's going to be repeated a little bit later in the presentation as well. Yesterday I made a quick edit change to sort of say I also need to introduce this earlier, in part because it's really important. I actually just took this out of the grant manual, and it's a little bit, certainly it's a kind of a process for doing historical interpretation projects. Usually it involves coming up with a plan, researching the topic, writing the content for it, and then you see that bright red line. That's where the division between all those sort of leading steps, and then the last step of what we refer to as implementation, which in the case of an exhibit is the fabrication and installation of it in the museum and gallery space. And when the legislature, so the voters created this, if it's not clear to everybody, this is grant program is funded by the Legacy Amendment, the sales tax constitutional amendment that was put together by voters, I I guess 12, 13 years ago now. And so while the voters created the program, when the legislature set up the funding mechanisms for it, for this grant program, they said that we had to use existing standards. And certainly one of the hallmark standards of doing a history project is peer review of the content that you're going to share. And for our grant program, we require, when you come to us to do, again, the implementation of interpretation, so in this case, the fabrication and installation of an exhibit, we need the finished exhibit text, some other things too, but the finished exhibit text and 2 letters of critical review. That's that existing standard. And so we don't allow a project that is creating the content and creating the exhibit in the same grant project. Now, we can fund all those steps, but you have to do separate grants at the very least for at the end to do the implementation. I will advise, and some of this will come out in the remarks, that those preceding steps, there are ways to do them all at once, and a lot of it depends on the size and scope of the exhibit, but there's also really a lot more sense in dividing those into some smaller phases as well. But we'll discuss some of those things, and if you have questions about that, you certainly can ask those questions. All right. So that beginning, the exhibit planning. So I'm organizing the presentation here around the application that we have for the exhibit program. So the application has the same questions if you are applying for an exhibit project, if you're applying to repair a roof on your National Register building, if you are cataloging your museum collection. It's all the same questions. There's a budget question, there's the project description, the need and rationale, work plan and timetable, project personnel, more and more and more. So the remarks and the way the webinar setup is, I'm going to be talking about the way you want to consider each of these questions for the different types of phases and projects that you would do to start your exhibit planning all the way down to the end of fabricating and installing it, and the imaginary ribbon cutting, as it were, of when you open the exhibit. So we're going to start with the exhibit planning piece of it. Exhibit planning is can have a variety of documents that are for it. Sometimes it can be with an initial interpretive plan. An interpretive plan isn't necessarily just about exhibits, but largely an interpretive plan. And there is a already recorded webinar about interpretive plans, so you can refer to that if you have more questions about those. But largely an interpretive plan is like, what types of programs are we going to do? How are they going to sort of like have a unified voice to them? And what does the audience want and expect from us, and sort of what are our abilities to meet that? And then it comes up with sort of like themes and concepts. And so if you've gone through that process, then you might be very ready to do an exhibit. And even if you haven't done that process, you might sort of like, if you're a museum, you're probably already ready to do exhibits. But the exhibit planning document is going to help you focus on what the content of the exhibit is going to be, what the key messages are going to be, and what the audience is going to sort of come away from. And so like the key concepts and big ideas, supporting themes and critical messages are the common contents of an exhibit plan. It can also sort of then follow up with concept designs, things like graphics and fonts and those types of things. And then schematic designs, which are going to get down to exhibit furniture, construction cases, and things like that. So that's what generally comes from an exhibit plan. So now we'll go into some of the fields that are in the grant application. So the budget field, again, and so in the green here after the parentheses, you'll see that it'll note when it's an actual application field. So the typical kinds of things that you'll see really vary in exhibit planning. Generally, the exhibit line item, or excuse me, the budget line items are going to be the personnel, the contractor, that you've hired to do this. An exhibit firm, an interpretive planner, that type of person or firm is going to be who you're going to hire to do this work. And a lot of times with exhibit planning, you might be doing some engagement events. If you're focusing on the Hmong community in your county, then you'd likely be doing some engagement events with them during the planning process, and so the cost of that can be a part of this as well. The project description, this is where you're going to describe the components of your plan and you're going to include a broad overview of your process. Typical things that we're going to ask for in these types of plans are the schematic designs. We're not really going to talk about exhibits in National Register of Historic Places buildings, but if it is going into a National Register building, there are some specific things that you want to consider, especially with a schematic design, and so you can connect with us about those specifics. But we're going to ask about the security considerations, object and artifact list, what the key messages of the exhibit plan will be, and then what the learning and objective outcomes are. So there's this broad overview of your process, talk about the engagement meetings, stakeholder meetings, those types of things. The need and rationale, this is again in every application, and I briefly described this as why are you doing this exhibit and why at this time? What's the priority for it? And there can be a lot of priorities for it. Some of them can be internal if it's part of the interpretive plan that you've done or a strategic plan that you're reaching out to this community that you want to interpret this community's history. So that's a good thing to put in the need and rationale. Maybe there's a specific anniversary coming up, one of those big, nice round numbers. It's the 100th anniversary of the county or the city or something like that. Those are excellent things to be putting into the need and rationale. The work plan and timetable, and this is just where you're describing each step in your planning process. If you're doing the audience engagement, describe the number of meetings that you're going to be doing. If you put in the meetings with the planner and your project staff, and then it's a report. It's an exhibit plan that's generally going to be the product that you're getting out of this. So you're going to want to build in some time to review the drafts of the plans, and then have a conversation with the consultant about things that you want to see changed in there and improvements that you want to make. The project personnel, these are just the key people that are involved in your project. And this is going to be similar advice for pretty much any of these applications for what to do with the project personnel. You're going to want to list any contractors or vendors and what their roles are with the project. If you include organizational staff, the applicant staff that are working directly on the project, and describe what their roles are. If the executive director has a key role in it, certainly list them, but tell us what exactly they're doing with the project. If they're managing the grant administration piece of it and handling the financial part of it, tell us that. Don't just sort of say that, don't just give us their qualifications, tell us what their role is in the project. And then do us the favor of indicating in the personnel section who's going to be paid with grant funds and who's not being paid with grant funds. If you're using your existing staff time as a match, that's great, and we love matches. They're not required, but just tell us so that we have a better understanding of it. All right, and then required attachments. You're going to see this information in just about all of them. There's required financial information for requests that are more than $25,000, and that can be the Form 990 Easy, this certified financial audit, or a year-end financial report that contains the proper information. So that's what you would get from what we would be looking for from an exhibit planning piece. Usually, you move into research at the next point. You've figured out exactly what you want. Well, maybe not exactly, but you figure out mostly what you want in your exhibit, and you've maybe discovered, well, we're doing it on this topic, and while we know some things about it, we've realized during the planning process and when we've engaged with some of the communities that there's more stories to tell, these things that we've sort of known, but we don't have sort of like good research on. So you want to go and find that. So grant-funded projects that produce research are going to require a final product of a research report. The grant program is very project-oriented, and projects produce products. And so with research, we're going to look for a research report as the final thing that comes out of a grant-funded research project. So the application is going to need to describe the intended content of the report, and it's going to need to include at least the following: a description of the research findings in relation to the questions that are in the initial research plan. I'll talk about research plan in a couple of moments here. And an annotated bibliography of all the sources consulted. Another thing that I like to see in these is sort of a treatment at the end of it that discusses possible uses of this research. Certainly, if you're working on your exhibit, that's a very likely possible thing to do with this research. But maybe in this research process, you found sort of another whole nugget of things that's only a little bit related to it, but you think that there's some good content there, and so there might be future interpretation around something else. Or maybe you found a whole bunch of 16 millimeter film footage, and you're not working on a documentary, and some of that might work its way into the exhibit, but you might say there's a documentary in here, maybe for us to do later, or maybe for somebody else to do later. Think of a research report as kind of a roadmap for people that are interested in the topic and adjacent topics too. All right, on to the application. Again, the budget field here, pretty similar to the exhibit planning pieces. Personnel and contractors, the people that are doing the work, are an exhibit budget line item. Travel costs, copies and research user fees. Those are pretty typical costs that we'll see in a research project. Project description field. The project description should set forth the parameters of your research project, and this should be presented as a research plan. So this is something that we're going to require. You can do a standalone research plan that's an attached document, but even when you do that, you should have some information that's in the project description field too. And so we're looking for a statement of the topic. What are the research questions that you're going to be posing? What are the, what's the information that you're looking for? And within that, sort of like, what do you already know about those topics, and what is it that you know that you don't know about it? And talk about the likely places that you're going to be going to do it. If you're from the Acme County Historical Society and you have an archive, probably going to be researching there. You might be coming to the Minnesota History Center to do research, or going to the University of Minnesota, or you might be going to some of your local history organizations that have their own resources too. So that research plan, this is where we sometimes see this with research projects that come into the grant program, where they're really very overly broad with what they are looking for. They want to research the history of their community. And we all know that's a very huge topic, and so we're looking for things to be narrowed down a little bit. And so a research plan it's a statement not only of the topic or the subject, but it's also going to narrow the scope by stating what questions are proposed. A research plan should also address what is currently known, as I've said here, and what are those known knowns and known unknowns. And the plan's also going to have to describe the likely resources that are used, as I've said here. The need and rationale. The need and rationale, this is where you're going to talk about, again, this is why this project and why now. So you would likely be saying that we need to know more information about this topic in order for us to do this exhibit that we've been planning for. That's a great need and rationale. You're going to want to talk about if you are covering things that haven't, maybe the topic has been covered, but you are looking for perspectives that are elevating absent narratives or previously underrepresented narratives. And so those are good things to include in your need and rationale. The work plan and timetable, this is where you're going to talk about estimating the number of hours that are needed for the research, planning in the time for travel to go to particular libraries. You're going to put in the time to research the report and to write the report. And I would encourage, though it's not required, I would encourage you to look for time for critical review as well. We do require it for the implementation pieces of writing. We don't require it for the research, but we've seen a couple of applications come in and funded projects that do critical review of the research report, and I think it really does benefit the project overall. All right, and project personnel. Again, similar things. You're going to want to list the contract, the historian that you're hiring to do the research, and tell us what their role is. If it's being supported by organization staff, talk about what their role is with it. They might be there to help the researcher access information that's in your archives, and they're matching their staff time with it. That's great. And then again, indicate who's going to be paid with grant funds and who's not being paid with the grant funds. The enduring value. This is we didn't really talk about this with the exhibit planning, but the enduring value and sustainability fields are also fields that are in all of the grant applications. And this is for enduring value. I kind of like to describe this as how are Minnesotans in the future going to benefit from this. And so what are you going to do with that research report besides the exhibit that you're working on? And at a minimum, make it publicly accessible and available. If you are a historical society and you have a research archive, just tell us that your plan is to put it into your archive. If that's not what you have and available, tell us about your plan to maybe place it in your local historical society so that researchers will have access to it. And for the sustainability piece, this is where you're thinking about, in some ways, your overall project, and talk to us about your plans and ability to turn this into an exhibit. And so the required attachments, again, we talked about the research plan. It doesn't have to be an attachment, to be clear about that, but it can be described in the application. But you can also include it as a separate attachment that's more specific and detailed. And then the financial information that's required for all of the applications that are asking for $25,000 or more. All right, so you've done the research. Now you want to get on to creating the content of the exhibit or the writing of it. So grant-funded projects that produce exhibit writing, they're going to require a final product of the final draft of the script for all of the interpretive components. So that's going to include labels and photo captions. If there's video or audio recordings, we'll need the script for those, or the transcript in some cases, if it's that type of document or file. So that's what we're looking for the final product from a writing project. For the budget, personnel contractor, excuse me, the personnel contractor that's doing it, we would definitely suggest, this is not required, but especially if you plan to come back to us to do the implementation, put a budget line item in there for letters of critical review. This is where you can actually use the grant funds to get that required piece for that next application. And so you are responsible for finding the people to write the letters of critical review. We can be helpful with that, but you're the one that's going to have to select them. And the going rate for these, we see it from $100 to $500 more dollars, and a lot of it's going to depend on the amount of work that you're asking, the amount of content that you're asking them to review. To do a review for a historical marker that's 300 or 400 words is a lot different than asking somebody to look at a very large 5,000 square foot exhibit. So plan accordingly for that. The project description. This is where you're going to talk about the scope of the exhibit, what the themes are for what you want people to learn when they've visited the exhibit, what you want them to take away from it. And you're going to want to describe the research that the content is based on. I think this is an important time to remark that you don't have to do all of these steps that we've talked about to create an exhibit with the grant program. You might be funding some of them on your own. You might come to us for the beginning part of it, and then build it, fabricate it with your own funds, or you might do it the other way around. And so if you have already done the research on your own, if you've done the research with us, then you could include the research report that you did in a previous grant. But if you haven't done that with us, then we're going to want to know, well, what is the research based on? So you could do your own research report or describe where you're getting the information from. Right, and then the need and rationale. Again, why this project and why now? So you're going to want to describe the steps that you've taken to get to this point. Describe the need for the exhibit and then the planning process that you have used. For the work plan and timetable, talk about just the timeline for this. What's the timeline? I think this is something you can put in all of these applications, but the hiring process. If you haven't hired or selected the content writer before the application and you want to do that after you receive the funding, which is fine. There's a lot of reasons to do that both ways. But talk about you want to add that into your timeline if you haven't done that, because sometimes it's not as easy to find the people to do the work, or there's a little bit of time delay with schedules and things like that. So build that into your work plan and timetable. Obviously, you're going to talk about how long it's going to take to write it, and then soliciting those critical reviews, and not just getting the critical reviews, but actually using them. And so build that into your timeline too. Somebody writes a letter that says, has some things to say about content that's in there, and you should build in some time to respond to that. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you can respond to those in an implementation grant a little bit later in the presentation. All right, and the need and rationale. Again, this is the why this project, why now. Wait, this is my slides are. Did that repeat? Hang on here. My clicker isn't working. There we go. All right. Project personnel. Again, list the contractors and vendors and what their role is. Include your organization staff. This is all repeat of all of the other pieces here. For the enduring value, again, this is where you want to talk about how this is going to, how people are going to be able to access this information later on. Certainly not just going to see the exhibit, but place the exhibit script in a publicly accessible repository. So again, if you are a historical site that has an archive, you can place it there, or you can work with your local organization to see if they'd be interested in having it in their collection. And then the required attachments for the application, it's just the financial pieces here. All right, so now we're going to get on to the to that last step, which in some ways people are often coming to us with at that point, which is fine. And so again, here's that that slide from the beginning. So we've gone through the planning, research, and writing process. And then there's that hard line for our grant program about where you have to separate those components to the implementation piece. So congratulations, you made it. It's you're getting ready for the exhibit implementation. So in this case, the product is the finished and installed exhibit. And so here the budget lines tend to get a little bit more, I don't know if it's more complex, but more things that are typically listed in there. And so pre-production costs can be in there, the space setup, if there's some things that need to be taken down in the exhibit gallery. If they haven't been, then those are complicated too in their own way, but sometimes it can include like the installation of carpeting or things like that. The printing of the exhibit panels, fabrication of those panels, the fabrication of the exhibit furniture, the mounts and the cases and those types of things, AV components, monitors, and the software for them. Lighting can be a part of this as well. And then certainly any of the media usage rights and fees for photographs and things like that that you're using in the exhibit. Those are pretty common budget line items. And for the project description, this is where you're going to want to talk about, this is where I like to say you should be taking us through what a visitor would expect in the exhibit. Describe it physically to us. Describe the content of it. What are the exhibit themes? What do you want visitors to leave the exhibit knowing? And this is where sort of those exhibit themes are particularly important, because if you're visiting an exhibit that's on the railroad history of Acme County, generally people aren't going to leave knowing and recalling the specific facts that are very important and everything is built on that are presented in the exhibit, but they're not necessarily going to remember that in 1954 there was 52,000 tons of grain that moved through the depot. That's not the type of thing that people are going to remember, but they are going to remember the big points, which is that the railroad changed this community, or the community, when the railroad left, the community changed in this way. And so those are the things that you're going to want to describe in that project description. And you're going to want to tell us also, like, well, what is this exhibit going to contain? I think some exhibit applications sometimes struggle to include all that information, and this is one of those things where, especially for the large grant applications, which are reviewed by a citizen advisory group called the Historic Resources Advisory Committee. And they are looking at a lot of applications, and it's very competitive. Usually there's 3 or 4 times the amount of funds requested as what's available. And sometimes exhibit projects can be pretty expensive. And I think the project description fields where you should be making it clear, why is this exhibit costing what it's costing? Well, there's a lot of interactive pieces to it, or there's a lot of video that's a component to it. And it's not just and there's nothing wrong with these things, but it's not just a banner draw shade exhibit, but that this is has a lot of technical pieces to it. Also that this is a 5,000 square foot exhibit, not a 800 square foot exhibit. So this is where you sort of also are describing the experience that someone's going to have and the expenses with it. And you're also going to want to describe how the exhibit connects to Minnesota history. And in some ways, this might sort of feel obvious, and maybe but this is also where you might need to get a little, use your sort of persuasive writing skills, especially for that large round. It's at a minimum, it's got to be, of course, about Minnesota history, but you're going to want to describe why this exhibit is important, not only to your community, but potentially to the state as well. And so really lean into your sort of persuasive side of things in order to make the grant application more competitive. You can do that in the project description field here. In the need and rationale, again, why this exhibit and why now? And this can be that, again, the anniversary is coming up, or that in your interpretive planning process, you have been working with a particular community and their history hasn't been very well portrayed. And so this is the opportunity to do that. And so that's a great thing to put into a need and rationale. And, what is the value of this history, and does this provide new interpretation? Again, that's going to help with the competitiveness of this too. Work plan and timetable. This is where you're going to talk about, again, how long, what are the specific steps that you're going to be taking for this. And so that is probably going to be the pre-production and final edits of the script, installation schedule, when is the exhibit intended to open, those types of things. That's what we're going to want in the work plan and timetable. And project personnel, same thing that we've been saying. Just tell us who's a part of the project and what their role is, not just what their qualifications are, but what their role is with it. And then do us the favor of indicating who's being paid with grant funds and who is not. All right, the enduring value. Again, just have a record of the interpretation after it closes. Those are the minimum things, and I think this is also for the large grant applications where you want to be persuasive here. Don't certainly talk about how knowing this content is going to help your community and the visitors, how it's going to help things in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't mean that you have to be sort of like overstating, or that world peace is going to be the enduring value of this exhibit, but do talk about how this is unique, and how it's going to have an impact on the people that are visiting it. And sustainability, I think this is very important also for many exhibits, but especially those ones that have more complicated and expensive pieces to it. What's your plan to maintain and repair the exhibit, especially those AV components? In my experience and in talking to others that have installed more technically advanced exhibits, they find that push buttons break, video is lagging, and the buttons don't work. And so are you ready to are you building into your own organizational budget some line items for your annual budget to address these things and be ready for them, because they do come up. And so how often is the out of order sign going to be put up in the exhibit, and do you have a plan for how to address it when that does have to go up? And inevitably, as soon as you put up an exhibit, you're going to notice that there's something wrong in there, a factual error or something like that. And so describe for us a plan of like how you're going to document those things, when you discover them and what your plan will be to update them. If something gets damaged or worn out, that's a perfect time to address the interpretation that's on there. So, but you know, how are you going to record it when somebody comes up to you and at the exhibit opening and says, "Oh, you know, this is my ancestor," and they're, you know, you spelled their name wrong or something like that. Might not be something you would want to address right away, but something that you could address when the exhibit component wears down. All right, and then required attachments for an exhibit implementation piece. These are things that you'll find in the manual. We're going to need a copy of the draft text and labels, a list of the likely objects to be used in support of the text, material specifications for exhibit furniture and mounts. Are you putting an object on a piece of furniture that is off-gassing and has bad paint on it? We don't want to fund that type of thing. So so describe that, and then the museum environment and the exhibit space. What's the temperature and humidity like in there? Tell us about how long it's going to be on exhibit, and then identify where the project documentation is going to reside. Where are you going to place the exhibit text? We also are going to require 2 thoughtful analyses of historical quality of proposed content, short phrasing, 2 letters of critical review, and so these chosen reviewers have to evaluate a copy of the draft text, the same text that you're submitting with the application. And this is one of those things too, where the where at a minimum you have to, you know, attach the letters of critical review, but sometimes those letters of critical review, well, oftentimes, and that's what the point is, it might have suggestions and point out things that are either in error or things that you might want to also consider with it. And we want you to use these letters of critical review. We don't need you to do everything that the content reviewer or that the critical reviewer says to do, but what we do want is that you can demonstrate how it's impacting the final draft of the text. And so, as an example, if in your text you say that an event happened in 1958, and one of the letters of review says, actually, this event happened in 1968. Well, you've got a couple of responses to that. It might be that, well, our research says it did happen in 1958, and so that's what we're going with. That's great. You've got the evidence and can show it to us. Or you could say, oh, based on this, we either, you know, a typo or something like that, or we had an error, and so we're changing the text to read 1968. That's a great way to do it. Oftentimes, letters of critical review are commenting on that they want more context to things, and that's a obvious thing in a something that I'm often looking for too. But exhibits have many great advantages, but they are in many ways required to be brief for it to be a good exhibit. So you might respond that the suggested additional content from the letter of critical review is outside of the scope of the project or outside of the themes, or there's not enough space to address it, those types of things. So being able to respond to those letters of critical review is great. And you can do that in just an attachment to the application, or you might describe it in the project description. And then there's the financial information there too, the requests that are above $25,000. So that's just the same old information. All right, so that's the end of the prepared remarks here. Here's my contact information again, todd.mahon@mnhs.org. And the grants office, the general email is grants@mnhs.org. I think that we respond to that. It's pretty quickly. It goes to a couple of our grants administration staff, and they either answer the questions among themselves very quickly, or they get it to us as content reviewers right away. And then Megan Brackup-Narvey is our outreach conservator. She's a content reviewer on those implementation pieces, and she's the person that you can talk to about the museum environment. And so she can be a contact for you as well. And as always, take a look at the grants manual. It's easily available on the grants page. Grants page is on the MNHS website. Our grant program funds a lot of different things, from putting a roof on your National Register building to exhibits to oral history projects. And so the grant manual, you download it and you say, my goodness, this thing is 150 pages long. Most of these things have their 6 to 8 page sort of section of the grants manual. And so the area that you are looking for is the what do we call it? Educational programs and interpretation, or interpretation and educational programs, and that'll talk to you about these exhibit projects. All right, I've realized that I was talking very, very fast, so definitely have time for questions and answers, and can review anything that's in there. So I'm going to stop presenting, and if there are questions, I am happy to answer.
Todd, I got a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
So, I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of organizations will run into is the idea of the size of your space, right? So the cost of using your example, like a 5,000 square foot exhibit versus an 800 square foot exhibit, it's going to be very different, both for implementation, but I would assume to some extent also for kind of all of these steps along the way, because you kind of know what space you're working with. So, looking at a lot of this seems like it's obviously a large grant. Is there any way you can envision that this would also be able to be scaled down for folks to do small scale wise, or does all of this strike you as large grant? And I guess, my concern there too is that the timeline of larger grants could
I think it's a great question, and for those that don't know, it's like the grant program has two funding levels. I talked a fair amount about the processes for the large round with the Historic Resources Advisory Committee, but other important differences. So like for small grants, those are for projects that are funded for $10,000 and less, and those happen. There are deadlines for those 4 times a year. The second Friday of January, April, July, and October. So there's lots of chances to get in, and then lots of chances to sort of keep a project moving. The large round only happens once a year, and so you only get one sort of chance per year. And it takes time for us to review it, and then for the HRAC to make their recommendations, and then for the final approval for it. So right now we're in the middle of we're doing our pre-application reviews for the current large round. So those were due on May 31st for the pre-application. Our staff is going to review and provide extremely helpful comments back to the applicants, and then they'll get their final applications in on July 28th or something like that. My calendar's blocked right now, but and then so comes back to us. We do another round of remarks on it that are there to help the HRAC understand the projects, and then so the HRAC meets to talk about them, and they make their recommendations, and then those go on to the MNHS Executive Council, and it's probably mid-December to January 1st that those projects would even start, because you can't do grant funded work until the grant funds are received. So then you're only like then the summer is when the next large round application would be, and then depending on the project, you might not be able to apply in time or finish your project in time to apply for something. So it can be difficult sometimes. So what can be small? And again, Dave, as you said, I mean, there's a whole big fat it depends on all of this. I think on those planning pieces, some of the planning processes can be broken up. If you've done an interpretive plan can be, which is generally for your whole organization, can be broken into smaller phases. Generally, those are a large grant. Not that they're $100,000, but they're generally $20,000 to $30,000. But you can break that into some phases where maybe you're doing the audience analysis, or you're doing, and then from that, you're doing sort of the development of the themes. And so it's not always the greatest process to do that, but that's one way that you can do that. I think, the research can often be a small grant, especially if you are, I know that you're working probably on an ag exhibit, Dave, and there's probably a good chance that you know a lot about it, but you're looking for some of the finer components to it too. Of you're updating it because you don't have much research from the 1980s on, or you want to talk about the 80s farm crisis or something like that. So I think might maybe sort of strategically pull out some of the exhibit research pieces. The fabrication, I mean, you probably don't really need to even need to or want to phase that, because if you can get that all in one shot anyway, then that's the end of it anyway. So it's just when the exhibit opens. But yeah, I don't know if that's great advice. There are ways that you can do it. And then I think the other thing too is be thinking about other funding sources. Again, you don't have to start with us at interpretive planning and exhibit planning and research and writing and the implementation. You might look to us to do some of those other components, and then you have some other funding that can pick up on some of those other things that aren't requiring you to have our grants, our grant projects closed before you apply for those other things. So.
I guess one follow-up to that question,
Mm-hmm.
and especially this last part you made about additional funding is, so I know that usually a grant isn't approved if it's already sort of in process, like if you're already in the middle of whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
But is there a way that we could, like, say you got a grant from another organization to get you kind of halfway through your research, could we then finish it with a legacy grant, or would we have to kind of apply as though we're starting from the beginning?
Yeah, I wouldn't apply as.
Yeah, I don't know how you might necessarily do that, if my question makes any sense.
I think I understand. Yeah, I mean, like, and I would welcome John or Melinda to chime in on this too. Like, to me, it's not so much sort of like I wouldn't apply as though you hadn't sort of done the work that you had done funded by the outside funder. But I think even with research, there might be sort of like a couple of topics that you have already done, or maybe information found at like maybe it's funding a trip to the National Archives or something like that, and you've done on your own with the other funds, the local research, as it were, the locally accessible research. I think that's a way that you might be able to do that. Yeah, I think, but I think you could just describe, well, this is for the research. I mean, this is the information that we're looking for. We've already found this other information, and these funds from the grant program would help us find whatever, how much corn was planted in 1968. So, all right, well, that's more uncomfortable silence than I can bear. So I will say that again, if you have questions, do feel free to send me an email or give me a phone call, and I'm more than happy to talk about these things. Recording of this is being made, and usually we get them posted and available within a couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm more than happy to share slides if anybody wants to send me an email. Then I can just share the slides as well.
Thank you, Todd.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.